another tool that we can use to modify objects, and that is the Select and Scale tool. To demonstrate how that works, we're just going to create a simple box in a perspective view, and then press Alt-W to maximize the perspective view. As you can see, we've created a box, and if we go into the Modify tab, we can rename the box and call it a green box. And we can see the length, width, and height of this box. So currently, the length is set to 72.22 centimeters, the width is 81.775 centimeters, and the height is 63.337 centimeters. So we can just round that off to a value of 70 by 80 by 60 centimeters. So one way to change the scale of our box here is to manually input the length, width, and height in the parameters section of the Modify tab. But what we can also do is use the Select and Scale tool to change the size of our object. So let's say if we're using the Select Object tool or the Select and Move, the way we can access the Select and Scale tool is either by clicking on the Select and Scale icon or pressing the shortcut, which is the letter R on our keyboard. So you can easily remember it because the four most often used tools are the Select tool, Select and Move, Select and Rotate, and Select and Scale. And these four tools are all bound to the letters Q, W, E, and R, which are right next to each other on the keyboard. So pressing R goes into the Select and Scale tool. Now, as you can see, when I press the letter R, it switches to different modes. So currently it's set to Select and Non-Uniform Scale. Pressing R again goes into the Select and Squash option. Pressing R again goes to the Select and Uniform Scale. So how do these work? When we're in the Select and Uniform Scale, if we hover over any of these three axes, so the Z, the X, or the Y axis, if we hover over it, it's going to turn yellow, which means that we're going to modify that axis. So what I need to do is left click and drag upwards or downwards to change the scale for that particular axis. So I can also change the width or the depth in this case. I can also change the width simply by clicking and dragging. If, however, I hover between the two axes, so let's say between the X and Z axis, you'll see that this rectangle gets highlighted along with the two axes. I just left click and drag, and so I scale them without changing its depth, so I'm just changing the width and the height. If I want to scale it uniformly, what I need to do is hover in the middle so that the three triangles all get highlighted, and then I can just left click and drag outwards or inwards to uniformly change the scale of my object. One tool that works quite similarly is the Select and Non-Uniform Scale. So it basically does the same thing, but the Select and Squash does a very different thing. And what it does is, if we change the scale on one particular axis, it automatically changes the scale of all of the other axes so that the entire volume of the 3D shape remains the same, which means if we make our object taller, it's going to get narrower and it's going to have less and less depth so that the overall volume of the shape remains the same. Now, this is a feature that I don't want to use ever, so I've never used it in my entire life, which means that if you go into the Select and Scale tool and start scaling it, and you can see that your object is getting sort of squashed as if it were made of rubber, and you're just, pulling it and pushing it and it's getting all deformed, you just need to press the letter R again to go into the Select and Uniform or Select and Non-Uniform Scale, and then you can scale any of the axes separately from each other or scale uniformly if you wish. It's not recommended though to use the Select and Scale tool when you're working with primitive objects if you want to achieve any results which are realistic. The reason for that is because when you're working with realistic objects, you want their scale to be the same as their scale within the world. So if we, for example, wanted to create a box that's 50 by 50 by 50 centimeters, we can just go inside, create a box, and then just go into the modify panel and type in the values: 50 for the length, 50 for the width, and 50 for the height. Press enter. So now we know that this box is exactly 50 by 50 by 50 centimeters within the units of our virtual 3D Max space, and all of the lights and the cameras are going to act accordingly. However, if we enter the select and scale tool and change its dimensions, so let's say that we want to make this box be 1 meter tall, 1 meter wide, and 1 meter thick, we can go into the select uniform scale tool, hover over the middle of the gizmo so that all of these 3 triangles get highlighted, and then just drag outwards. At this point, we have basically a box that's roughly 1 meter by 1 meter by 1 meter, which means that it has a bigger volume than the one that we had at the beginning. But the problem is that if you go into the modify panel and look at the parameters, the length, width, and height are still set to 50 by 50 by 50 centimeters. So these parameters haven't changed. We just changed the scale of the object. So what's the basic difference between changing the length, width, and height of the object and the scale of the object? Well, basically, if we look down here, you'll see that the scale of the object is set to 199.653%, which basically means that this object has a scale of 50 by 50 by 50 times 2, because its current scale is almost 200. We can set it to 200 manually by just typing in 200. So what you can see is that this box has double the scale of this 50 by 50 by 50 box that we created at the very beginning, which is not very intuitive because these parameters aren't going to get updated if we change the scale of the box. So what we want to do is avoid changing the height, width, and depth of any object using the select and scale tools. And what we want to do is change these parameters here in the parameters section of the modify panel so that we always know what the actual scale of our object is. So what we're going to do is go down here and instead of 200 type in 100, which means that we reset the scale of this object. And if we want to set it so that each of its sides is exactly 1 meter or 100 centimeters long, we're just going to go in and type in 100 by 100 by 100. And so now we're certain that the scale of this object is 100 by 100 by 100 centimeters. There is another thing that we need to be mindful of when we're using the select and uniform or select and non-uniform scale tools. As you can see right now, the gizmo is aligned with the object that it's affecting, which means that if we change the width or height or depth of this object, the object is not going to get deformed. So all of the sides which are parallel are going to remain parallel to each other. So we're not going to get any deformations when using the select and scale tool. However, some things would change if we were to use the select and rotate tool and rotate the object and then try to scale it again. So let's go ahead and do that. I'm going to press the letter E on my keyboard to enter the select and rotate tool. And I'm going to rotate my object by any value along the x-axis. So let's say I'm going to undo this by pressing Ctrl Z, and then I'm just going to press the letter A to enter the angle snap toggle. So now I can rotate by exactly, let's say, 20 degrees around the x-axis, and let's say around 5 degrees around the y-axis. So now our object is rotated, as you can see right here. If we press R again, you see that our gizmo, our scale gizmo, is not aligned to our object, it's aligned to our world, which means if we start scaling it, our object is going to get deformed. So certain lines which were parallel are not going to be parallel anymore, and we're going to get more and more deformations as we carry on doing this. And this, of course, is an unwanted behavior. We seldom want our box to be deformed like this. We might want it to, but at this point, I don't think it's something that we want to happen. So just to undo all of this, we can go down here and type in the value of 100. And it's going to reset the scale of this box so that it's all nice and not deformed as it was previously. So how do we make this gizmo be aligned not with our world or with the view, but with the object as it's rotated? What we want to do is go up here into the reference coordinate system menu. I'm going to click on that, and currently it's set to view, which means that even if I rotate, it's always going to remain aligned to our view. What we want to do is set it from view to local. And what that means is that our reference coordinate system for the select and scale is going to be aligned to the object itself. So however we rotate the object, so let's say we want to go and rotate it some more, and press R again, gizmo is going to stay aligned to the object at all times, which means if we start scaling it, we're not going to get strange deformations that we've gotten before. It's always going to scale nice without skewing the edges and going into some warps that we don't want to have. The three most often used reference coordinate system settings are either local, which means that it's always aligned to the object, world, which means that it's always aligned to the world regardless of which viewport we're using, and view, which means that it's viewport dependent. The viewport dependency basically means that whichever viewport we're using, the Y is always going to be the vertical axis and the X is always going to be the horizontal axis. And you can see that if we go to the top view, where currently the Z is pointing upwards and the X is pointing right, when we click on it to highlight it, it's going to change so that the Y is pointing upwards and the X is pointing right. And it's the same with the left view. Currently, Y is pointing left, Z is pointing upwards, but if we click on it, again, it's going to switch so that Y is pointing upwards and X is pointing right. If we switch to the world, what you see is what you get, and regardless of which specific viewport is selected, the reference coordinate system is always going to stay aligned in exactly the same way. So the two reference coordinate system settings that I use most often are either world, which means aligned to the world, or local, which means aligned to the object upon which it's dependent. Each of these tools, so the select and move, select and rotate, and select and scale tools, can have different settings for their reference coordinate system orientation, which means that, let's say the select and move tool is currently set to view, that we can set it to be aligned the same as the object. So we're going to go into the select and move tool, and down here we're going to select local, which means that it's going to be aligned to the local space of the object. And we can go into the select and uniform scale tool and switch it back from the local to the world alignment. And switching back to the select and move tool, you'll see that the select and move gizmo is still aligned to the object, whereas the select and scale is aligned to the world. And you can change this at any point in time. Another thing that you might notice is that currently our gizmo is set at the center of the bottom side of our object. So I'm just going to reset the rotation of our object by pressing the letter E and then just typing in 0, tab 0, tab 0 to realign my object with the world. I'm also going to reset its scale by pressing the letter R, going to the select and scale, and then just type in 100 so that the scale is 100%. Now, if we don't want our gizmo to be set at the base of our object, and we want to be in the center of our object for whatever reason, we can do that by going into the Hierarchy tab, clicking on the Affect Pivot Only button, and then just click Center to Object. That means that the pivot is going to automatically be set in the center of our object. Once we've done that, we can just click on the Affect Pivot Only again, and the pivot remains in the center of our object, which means we can scale from the center and not from the bottom side of our object. Another situation where you might want to change the position of the gizmo or the reference coordinate system in your object is if, for example, you want to change the pivot point around which your object rotates. So let's just demonstrate that. I'm going to go into the box. So we're in the Create panel, Geometry, Standard Primitives. I'm just going to click on Box, go into the Perspective view, just left click and drag and create the box. Doesn't matter what size it is. Mine currently is set to 53 by 36 by 99 centimeters. Let's round it out to 50 by 35 by 100 centimeters. So we have this box here. And currently, if we access the Select and Rotate tool by pressing the E letter, you'll see that the gizmo, or the reference coordinate system, is set in the middle of our base by default. So if we try and rotate the object now, using the Select and Rotate tool, it's going to rotate around that specific point. What if we want to change the position of our reference coordinate system so that it's in the middle of our object, and so that when we rotate around the middle? The way we can do that is going into the Hierarchy, then clicking on the Affect Pivot Only button, and just click Center to Object. As you can see, it's going to place the Rotate gizmo at the very center of our object. And now, if we just click on the Affect Pivot Only button again, you'll see that our reference coordinate system, or our gizmo for our rotation, remains in the center of our object. So if we want to rotate our object now, we can do so while rotating it from the middle. But we can also manually set the position of our reference coordinate system to wherever we want it to be. So if we want to rotate the object around the top, we can again go into the Hierarchy tab, click Affect Pivot Only, and then we just need to move it a little bit, and you can see that we're going to get these larger arrows around our regular arrows. And so we just move our pivot point. As you see, we're not moving the object itself, we're just moving the pivot point, and we're going to move it to whichever point we want to rotate around. So let's say we want to rotate around this point right here. We can leave it there. Just make sure to turn off the Affect Pivot Only button. So I'm just going to click on it again. And now if we press E to rotate, you'll see that we're going to rotate around that specific point. One thing to note is that the pivot point can even be outside of the volume of the object. Even though that seems a little bit weird, we can still do that if we want to. Again, just going to the Hierarchy panel, click on the Affect Pivot Only, press W to move the pivot, and then just move it anywhere outside of the volume of the object. Let's say here. turn off the effective only, press E to rotate. You can see we're going to rotate around this specific point, even though the point is not within the volume of our object. If we want to reset it, we just go into the hierarchy tab, effective only, center to object, and it's going to be reset to the center of our object.